next introducer is Alyssa Goodman, who's a professor of astronomy here at Harvard and also at the Center for Astrophysics. And we're collaborating on a, I guess, PredictX project, although she's the main investigator on it. So.
Hi. So as John just mentioned, I'm an astronomer by training, and I rely very heavily on technology. So it's a little bit ironic that I get the excellent job of introducing Bob Koester, who's going to tell us about lost person behavior. And he will tell us about a big, very important database that he's assembled about that. But really, the people who are lost do not rely on technology and are lost. And actually, I want to give you, before I give you a little bit more about his background, in honor of the spirit of Radcliffe, I want to tell you my favorite quote that I found when researching Bob's career online. He has an interview in Backpacker magazine where he was asked what the most common mistake a lost hiker will make is. And it says, most people, especially males, just keep plowing ahead in the direction they were going, in the hope, I guess, that just around the corner they'll see something they recognize. He'll tell us in his remarks, I think, that that does not work. He is, as far as I can tell, the world's expert on what the title of his book here says, Lost Person Behavior. I'd like to admonish my friends from the Harvard Library who are here that the Harvard Library did not own a copy of this book until right this moment when I officially bequeath this book to the Harvard Library. Anyway, that book is a field guide to finding people who are lost, and that is this topic of Bob's talk. He's going to explain how that works and how the procedure works, but it's a very interesting story as to how he got to be the person who wrote this book. So he obviously likes adventure because the clothes he's wearing are not the clothes that he normally would wear, he explained to me, because he spent the last few days getting all the way back here from Inuvik in the Northwest Territories. For those of you who don't know, that's 7,415 kilometers from here, about 6 plane flights. Every method of technology I used to figure out how to get from here to there says you can't. But anyway, he got back and his luggage did not. So he's come to us through this very recent route, but his longer route started when he got interested in search and rescue when he was still a Boy Scout. And then shortly after his Boy Scout experience, he did go to college, and he did major in neurobiology at the University of Virginia, but even while he was doing that, he was involved in search and rescue in Virginia with a group, the Appalachian Search and Rescue Conference. And that was in the early 1980s. And then he started to realize that there were some people putting together data on lost hikers and other lost people, and that in particular, patients suffering from dementia, notably Alzheimer's patients, would be lost, and he would help search for these people, and it was quite predictable what they would do. And he even has some story that maybe he'll tell you about the length of his thumb on a map, and he could tell exactly where they were going to be from this. And so he was very good at this, and he started to see patterns. And he took a scientific statistical approach and tried to assemble, and he has now assembled, the biggest database that there is, along with collaborators, about lost person behavior. And so just to give you some idea, in the 1980s when he started, there were maybe hundreds of cases documented that were in this database, and he told me last night that there are over 100,000 cases now, thanks to his efforts. And he has a private company called DBS Productions that specializes in search and rescue. He goes around lecturing a lot and training people like the people he was talking with in Inuvik. I don't think he went there completely for fun. Anyway, but the other thing that I should tell you that I don't think it says anywhere on his bio is he told me that we heard from Liz Cohen this morning that there are no academic departments, really, of search and rescue. And you'll see that his affiliation is listed as research associate at Kingston University in London. Well, that's because he wanted an academic affiliation to help get access to the literature and also to get a PhD. So very soon, in about a year, he says he will be the very first PhD of search and rescue. So let's welcome the very first doctor of search and rescue, Bob Koester. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that kind invitation, and thank you for inviting me here. And I guess to just quickly finish the story, I had kind of developed a sense of where to look for people with dementia. But in the middle of the night on a search I wasn't able to actually attend, I get this very panicky call because my rule was they're found about the length of my thumb on a 1 to 24,000 scale map. So the call I get was, Bob, we have to know the length of your thumb. And I thought that there might be better ways to communicate these ideas, so that's what I set out to do. And in search and rescue, the entire problem we look at is one of where. It's all about where. We often think of a search as the classic mystery, but instead of a whodunit, it's a wheredunit. Where are we going to look? Where are we going to find them? And certainly, where are they going to be? So we kind of start off with some basic things, like where was the subject last seen? We'll pretty much always know that. Where was the subject headed? Well, we may not know that. And has the subject been lost before? And where so? That's particularly important when we're looking for those who have dementia. Then, sort of the basis of my research is where have similar subjects been found when they were lost? And from the behavior of lots of other previous people, we hope to predict where this one person might be. Although I'm kind of fond of saying, I'm really good at telling you where 100 lost people are going to be found. For our unique individual, it can be difficult. And finally, the key question is, where are they now? And from that, I have to make my decision of where am I going to actually send my resources to find them. So yes, I collect data based on previous cases, but I kind of like saying that the data is useless until you actually put it in a format that it's providing some information. Usually dealt with statistics. And then I have to present those stats and summary stats in a way a search planner, who may or may not know anything about statistics, can understand it, and it's up to them to make the decisions of where they're going to send their resources. So we have a missing 11-year-old female. She has Asperger's, which is at the high end of the autism spectrum disorder. She told her mother she was going to go out and film a nature video. She was last seen, make sure I don't point myself in the eye. She was last seen at her house. Quick search of the immediate area located her bicycle. IPP stands for Initial Planning Point. That's where our search effort's going to begin. Now, imagine for a moment you had only been on 8 searches in your entire search career. You had looked for a missing hiker. You had looked for another missing hiker. You looked for a guy who fell off a raft into swift water. You looked for somebody who had dementia. You looked for a 10-year-old boy. You looked for a 16-year-old boy who has autism, another dementia subject, and a despondent subject. Of those searches, which would you predict would actually give you the most information of where to look for our missing 11-year-old? I'm not going to make audience participation today because I'm limited on time, but probably these 2 searches with an emphasis on this one. You would then be what I call the most dangerous type of search planner, the one who bases things off of a single case. Because the next search really isn't like the last one. Well, wouldn't it be nice to have had 62 searches for those with autism in your sort of experience self? And that would actually be pretty darn rare to be somebody who's looked for 62 people with autism. But by using past cases collected in the database, that's what we hope to achieve. And what I like to point out to my searchers is each of those very boring records actually does represent an actual human case and an actual incident. You could plot the data in the most bizarre way I could think of plotting data, which is you just start throwing all the numbers of previous cases on your case. I actually did this in miles, but you actually start to see some patterns exist. You know, a lot of people are found close, out at about 1 mile. There's another little bit, and then you got people who go even further. A more reasonable thing to do would be to plot quartile data. So there's a 25 percentile, there's the 50 percentile, the other rings are essentially off the map. Now this turned out to be a 4-day search because the search planners initially kind of ignored this approach, tried to base it upon investigations. Investigations said this subject hated to get her shoes muddy. Therefore, they excluded looking in the woods. It was a non-searcher who got a message from God that that was a good place to go look, and that's where she was found, just a little bit outside the 25 percentile, which should have been a primary search place to look. She was fine. And the stuff about the shoes, she was wearing her mother's shoes that day. She actually took a couple of photographs out there showing some behavioral profiling, things that we like to pass on. A lot of people with autism are attracted to water, reflections, and light. So autism is just one of the many subject profiles we actually work with. Right now in the book, I have 41 profiles. I'll probably be creating another half dozen or more with the new data. But we actually have to create a hierarchy of, you know, what do you do with, you have a 6-year-old child that jumps on a bike or go fishing. Do you use the child category or do you use the fishing category? So we kind of have, I won't go into this in too much detail, but we have external forces. So if they go in the water, if they jump in an airplane, we're going to look for a missing airplane, even if the pilot has dementia, which I have stories like that too. If they jump on a car or a bike, that's going to predict sort of what their overall mobility is. If they have a cognitive issue such as autism or dementia or despondent, we're going to use those. If none of that applies, is it a child? If it is a child, what is the age of a child? Because obviously a 2-year-old is going to behave differently than a 14-year-old. Although if you have 14-year-olds, you may wonder if you actually have a 2-year-old. And finally, what were they actually out there doing? Hikers, hunters being very common profiles. So to kind of get that kind of insight, I've been collecting data since 2002. Initially had 50,000 sources, managed to just find some more funding, this time from Homeland Security, Science and Technology. So within the last 6 months, I collected 100,000 new cases, and I got funding for the next 2 years. So I'm going to continue to do that, and I'm also switching to tools that allow people to submit prospective data instead of, in the past, it's always been retrospective data with all of those complications and headaches. Now, since my goal is to actually predict behavior for the person I'm looking for, one of the challenges when you collect worldwide data is if you collect data for somebody lost in Newfoundland and you're trying to look for somebody in the Florida Everglades, that's probably not a good approach. So one of the things I classify everything in my database by is what ecoregion it's actually coming from. And by using ecoregions, I got similar type of terrain, and then we only use the data that matches the terrain we're actually conducting our search in. I recently created some actual standards. Since this has been a one-person show for a number of years, I thought it might be a good idea to share what my actual standards are. They're starting to be adopted around the world. So that's where my data actually comes from, and I do a great job of Western civilization countries that predominantly speak English. That's my own problems and limitations. This is where the data essentially comes from in the United States, with the states in yellow contributing data. I didn't mean to match the political elections or anything like that, but it seems to be what has happened. And essentially states in yellow are where it's more mountainous, and in more mountainous areas, SAR teams have been around longer. Where teams have been around longer, government has gotten involved, and where government hasn't gotten involved, they make them fill out paperwork. And the paperwork is the source of my data. And what my data essentially does is create 6 spatial models. The first spatial model is if that's where they were lost, how far away were they found? So that would be distance from that initial planning point, typically shown in quartiles, simply because that's easy for a searcher to draw on a map. We just recently started making more fancy parametric, logarithmic type models. That requires GIS. But most searchers around the country now will draw the 4 rings on the map. Our second model we call a dispersion model. In this model, we know where they were last seen, and we actually have a destination of where they were headed to, or we found a clue that gave us a pretty solid clue that told us they were heading this way. So it asked the question, once we know what direction they were heading, well, where were they actually found in relationship to that heading? Our third model is a fairly straightforward model. It's an elevation model. Did they go uphill or did they go downhill? And what we find is about half the people go downhill. About 20% stay at the same elevation. And about a third, yeah, I know it doesn't add up because I talk to SAR people, I round things off. And a third go uphill. And we're certainly seeing more people going uphill these days, because when some people get lost and they don't get a cell phone signal, the tendency is to want to go up. Of course, sometimes you get to the top of the mountain and there's still no cell phone signal. This is a kind of a fancy looking one. I call it the track offset model. When I was initially doing a lot of my dementia lecturing, I was forever saying the subject with dementia is typically found not that far off of a road or trail, which begs the question when you're trying to program a computer, you can't type in not that far. So I needed actual numbers of how far. So for dementia in a temperate environment, 50% of those subjects are found within 15 meters of a road or a trail. So 15 meters is truly not that far. If you're looking for a lost biologist, well, good luck. They have track offsets, like 600 meters because they're doing their research far away from a road a lot of times. This is a mobility model. So what we record is how long does a lost subject typically stay in motion. We can then link up that time in motion with a cost mobility map of how far you could typically get, and that's actually what I'm showing here. How far could you get in 1 hour? How far could you get in 2 hours? How far you could get in 3 hours? For those with dementia, we know they actually, 50% only stay in motion for 15 minutes. Then they often get stuck, and that's where they stay. 95% stay in motion for 18 hours. So obviously, you can get a whole lot further. And the times are skewed downwards because search and rescue ruins a perfectly good experiment. When we find them, we pull them out of the woods. We don't continue to walk behind them until they collapse. Try getting that one past an IRB. And our final model up here that I'm showing at least is the find location. Where do we actually find them? In fields, in woods, in drainages, on roads, and on trails. And this is a nice model because it matches what everybody in search and rescue knew anyhow. Without my research, we find them on roads, we find them on trails, we find them on linear drainage type features. And what I'm sort of convinced DHS to do is to take all these models and dump them together into a piece of software where the computer then says, here's the high probability areas to look, Here's second probability areas to place. It really, the computer model really liked this trail, and it liked this field up here. Now, I think you'd be silly to only trust computer models when it comes to human behavior. So we let the human have some say through a consensus process as well, and then we can combine the two models together, which for marketing purposes, I'm going to call the guts model, because you could say trust your guts. And it just stands for the Grand Unified Theory of SAR. It's not as complicated as your stuff, but it's good marketing. And we actually think about the process of getting lost. Now, nobody sets out to be lost. Well, not too many people set out to be lost. I have Vision Quest category. They're an interesting one. Most people probably know where they are when you start your hike. You move for a certain distance, you make an error at what we call a decision point or choice point. Then, without realizing you made an error, you continue to move based upon how the land and environment subtly pushes you at a subconscious level. Now, this could be very kind of overt. You make your error at a trail junction and you're on the wrong trail, you'll continue to go wherever that trail goes. You'll probably keep pushing ahead for maybe quite a while because of something known as confirmation bias, which I like the term bending the map, where you only pay attention to information that tells you you're right. You ignore everything that tells you you are wrong. So when a hiker got turned around in New Zealand and noticed the sun was actually rising in the west, he had a compass. He knew it was the west. He scratched his head and said, it must just be what happens in the southern hemisphere. He needs to sign up for John's class. Then there's a period of anxiety, which, once again, if you're a male, that the Y gene requires you to keep moving. And then finally, an actual realization, I am lost. Now what am I going to do? That's when a self-rescue strategy picks it. So here we have the classic choice point or decision point. And this is what we have out in the woods. There's the trail there. It may even look like it's going that way. In fact, it turns that way. So if our subject went that way instead of going that way, this would be the single point you could say they went wrong. It could be conscious. It could be an unconscious choice. Sometimes when we look at maps, these things really jump out at us. So here we have a case of a 17-year-old female. She was part of a, disciplinary problem. So she was put in a experiential group. We nicknamed these Hoods in the Woods. We're search and rescue. We're really not too PC of a group. So she was last seen heading down this way. The counselor said, hey, if you're feeling slow, just catch up. And they essentially left her behind, something I definitely don't recommend. So she's following the Appalachian Trail, which runs like this. Just for scale, those are kilometer grid marks. She comes up here. This would be a saddle where it goes up and over, so you could hold on there and your butt would fit in there. Your legs could go on either side of that. The trail takes a sharp turn. Since it's a ridge, I know there's animal trails running along the top of the ridge, and along the top of the ridge to the closest water, there's probably an animal trail as well. So she could have kept going straight, or she could have continued on the trail. It takes a turn. She might have gone that way. Comes down here. We have a junction of two trails. So she certainly could have gone that way. Comes down here. There's a little road that goes to this barn right here. Or she could have kept on going. We certainly know she didn't wind up at the end, though. So a given is she made a mistake. Well, it turns out her mistake, I would actually say that's the most likely one, but people don't always do the most likely one. She made the mistake here, came up and over the ridge and down the other side. So terrain analysis would tell us that's the most likely path. She could have tried contouring, but people who contour eventually get sucked down. If she had a cell phone, maybe she would have tried for this peak. She didn't. There's no coverage up there anyhow. Well, she was eventually found right below the A in the word national. Of course, the problem was the find team radioed it in. She's in the creek below the A in the word national. So early on in my search career, I spent my time over there in the second A in national, being part of the evac team. And then I said, I think I need to get in search management and teach these things. So what are the various strategies when people get lost? The first one is no strategy at all. We see this in young kids, which is just a random walk. Of course, a random walk eventually over time with one person can actually get you a little bit distance. Another strategy some people will follow is I'll go in one direction. And as long as I go in one direction, I'll get myself out of the situation. Well, here was one person who did it during the daylight, and it actually works pretty darn well. I mean, these aren't lost people. This was just classic experiment. You get some undergrads, you want some credit, come out and try to walk a straight direction. The white arrows are pointing towards the direction of the sun. Second daytime experiment, person did well, got to the edge of the woods. Well, we can't have any of that. Get back in the woods. They did fine. The blue lines are people doing the same experiment, this time at night. So we start here. AY didn't do a half bad job. RF, you can notice we got circling going on. We got both counterclockwise and clockwise circling going on from the same person. So humans are actually just lousy at inertial guidance. We gotta have some feedback. KS doesn't get far at all. He or she is just walking in circles. KS also participated in the same experiment, trying to walk blindfolded on a flat surface, and would just circle and circle and circle. Here we see a kind of a common pattern. This was a lost 10-year-old, came off the trail here, and he just followed the contour around the mountain until he got back to the trail. And then we also, probably the most common pattern we see is when people can latch onto a route of some sort. This was an 8-year-old with autism. He followed the road. He followed a trail. He followed a power line. He followed the service road. He followed the power line. And then he started following this ridge up to where there was a blinking light. And that was his goal, to get to the blinking light. Other people will backtrack. It turns out it's extremely rare. Only about 2% of the people I look for have backtracked, which is just let's turn around and go back. Heading for a landmark, following folk wisdom, view enhancing, or in the more modern age, they call you on the cell phone, I'm lost. They set off an emergency beacon, or some people's strategy, I'm just going to stay put and somebody will come and find me. Because I remembered to tell people I'm going to actually go out someplace. So let's just look at this incident real quick. This was a planned circuit hike by a father and son. The father has traumatic stress disorder. The son was described as a couch-playing couch potato. So they camped over here overnight. They were told about a shortcut. Shortcuts are always dangerous things. You could probably see what is a potential decision point right there. That is, in fact, where they made the error, and that's what they did the first day. And that's where they spent their first night. So they're following the drainage. The second day, they continue to follow the drainage. They make it all the way up to this saddle. That's a decision point. They decide just following this up is a bad idea. Let's change strategies, and let's try to contour. Then the very next night, they change strategies again and say, let's follow the ridge because we know it will bring us back down to where we know a road is. And that's where they finally bumped into some of our SAR teams. Although they were planning on going back up because that said, that's a bad idea because that's where our car is. And so for the final incident I'm going to do, this is a dementia case where our subject kind of makes his own database for us. First time he went lost, he just kind of went out the backyard and was found in the drainage. The next time he went lost, he went out the front yard and followed the driveway around and was found a short distance off his driveway. Winter came, winter went, spring was in the air. It was time to go wandering again. This time he followed the drainage a little bit further. Law enforcement had a few choice words for the family at this point, and they built a fence. The only problem with the fence was, like every great home project, the gate was not put on, and the gate hole is pointing that way, and lo and behold, that's where he was found, getting stuck in some briars and brambles. The gate went on, but there was no latch. The latch went on, but there was no lock. And that's where he was found. I was doing a study at this point. I went out and interviewed him, severe Alzheimer's at this point. He was nonverbal. I was interviewing the son, sitting in the backyard. There was still no latch on the thing. Out came his dad, wandered around, hit the latch, and started heading off this direction. The son was not the least bit concerned. I was a little bit concerned because we were about to launch into a search, and I was going to get in big trouble if he got lost while I was there. So looking at the future of SAR, I think as long as there's Murphy, things require batteries, or there's just people doing silly things, search is going to be needed. My research and those who contribute to it will give us better data. We'll continue to build better models. I hope 10 years from now, people will laugh at how crude my model and simulation is. And most importantly, that allows the searchers to make better decisions and for everybody to have better results. And I've been funded by Homeland Security and the Department of Agriculture. I don't know why. But I have a data entry team of 5 people, 32 reviewers, and 63 people who contribute data to me. So thank you.
So I think I take the prerogative of first thanking you. That was excellent. Thank you. And then asking the first question, which is just, you had on your slide here that 63 people contribute data, but has the search and rescue community kind of embraced this quantitative empirical approach, and are they looking to you for more information now? In other words, are you having to push it on them, or are they pulling it from you?
It's a combination of both. Mm-hmm. Certainly, those people I talk to really love the data approach, and basically because it's working, and they can appreciate that. I usually those people who don't like the approach aren't willing to talk to me. So I find about it, a recent case, somebody was found on the 75 percentile to 95 percentile ring, and they said, look, I told you it didn't work. But more countries are actually at a country level adopting essentially my de facto standard. So it's kind of growing around the world.
And then I have one more question that I think is for more than one of the speakers, which is, are there cultural differences where people who grow up with more or less connection to nature around them or to navigation in some way actually get lost more or less?
Right. If you look at the countries where I collect my data from, they're essentially Western civilization countries. So I'm usually quick to point out my conclusions are valid for Western civilization. Although when I was recently up in Inuvik, one of the searchers was because the searcher is also a school teacher, and as part of their activities, they'll actually take them out in the woods for a week. I mean, I never had a PE class like that. But she said that the native children will stay on the trail because that's what the elders have taught them to do. The Western civilization kids are running helter-skelter everywhere.
That's what I was afraid you would say. Okay, so let's take some questions from the audience, and if you'd please remember to introduce yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
My name is Thomas DeFazio. I have some technical background. I made an assumption about your thumb, and it brought me out to 1,200 feet, about a quarter mile on a 24,000 map, which seems to me a lot smaller than some of your diagrams. So I'll look for a comment on that. But the real question, search and rescue has been done in a lot of fields, and a lot of technical work has been done in the area, and I'm curious if you have accessed some of it. I see some of it in your work, whether you use some of it, and some examples. World War II, what to do with the radar on anti-aircraft guns, how to deploy it, how to search for submarines. Now, admittedly, in those two cases, they're not ridge lines and features. But finally, search and rescue by airplane over land, that's been done for very, very many years, and there are features, and there must be a fair bit of literature on how to do that. So I seek comments on those two subjects. Thank you.
Okay. I got three. Well, that's a mile on a 1 to 24,000 scale map. You do search and rescue long enough, you get that down. So there's my thumb. So my thumb actually comes out to about a kilometer, which I'm used to actually, do all my measurements in metric. And that represents about the 50 percentile for subjects. So half the subjects would be found within that distance, and half the distance would be further out. Sorry, it was the length of my thumb.
That's why he had to start a
Hence
quantitative
the need of,
database, right?
more quantitative approaches, yes. Certainly, the origins of modern search and rescue come out of World War II, where operations research was first used heavily for the first time. Goodman is kind of considered the father of modern search and rescue, and all of his efforts were aimed at looking for, detecting, and sinking German U-boats. So a lot of the formulas we still use to the day come out of those early efforts. I'm not familiar with shooting airplanes out of the sky, though. For aircraft, on the other hand, a lot of the tables we do use of how well an aircraft can actually search for a subject on the ground also comes out of World War II, although it hasn't been really vetted, and nobody knows where the data or raw data comes from anymore at this point. Searching from an aircraft for subjects on the water has been really well established. And there's another side to search and rescue I didn't go into, but is sort of the other half of my research, is not only do you have to send a team to the right place, but the team that's actually sent there has to detect it. And that's called probability of detection, and that's a whole nother talk onto itself. But thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tanya Bartevian. You have pointed out that with individual cases, the situation might vary. So I was concerned about the categories misleading people who were doing a search. So I was wondering what advice you might have to people who are doing the search about how much to follow your guidelines and when to ignore them, or when to, diversify.
Right. The subject categories are mostly for the initial response of getting things going. If you wait until you develop a full behavioral profile and truly know all the unique background of the person you're actually looking for. That takes 4 to 12 hours to go through that investigative effort. And you can imagine if the family members were waiting for 12 hours, you say, well, we want to get a complete picture of the person first. So what the subject categories allow you to do is you can start with generalizations that statistically most of the time will work out well. And if it doesn't work out, then hopefully, it's going to take you 4 or 6 hours to get those initial tasks out anyhow, that if those don't work out, now you could jump to hopefully what your investigation into that unique individual is starting to show you. And while I say, the textbook says, it's my own textbook, the textbook says look to a category, the simple reality of any search is I'm often flipping to 3 or 4 different categories because I have to blend them all together. And I have a computer model to also blend them together, but most people are just using paper and pencil technology.
And because there might also be categories that we are not yet aware of, for example.
Well, like I said,
I'm sure you're aware.
There's already 6
Right.
new ones I'm working on.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Carpenter. I'm a political scientist here at Harvard, and also I co-direct the social sciences, or direct the social sciences program at Academic Ventures here at Radcliffe. Having been lost a few times treading around fishing sites in northern Michigan, the random walk graph that you displayed hit a little bit closer to home than I might have liked. And it led me to a couple of ideas. I mean, the graph looked familiar also because once back in graduate school, I was working with a mathematical theorist trying to apply Bessel processes to certain kinds of political processes, which is a whole other conversation, but it looked a lot like a Bessel process. But the one question is, again, having been lost, how does one distinguish disorientation from randomness in a data, in a kind of a data walk of that sort? So, people who are lost can get disoriented in a way that I suspect myself, having been disoriented a few times for all sorts of reasons, might behave a little bit differently from the kind of random walk behavior that was either postulated or observed among that one student. And I think the other question would be is that, again, from the standpoint of the lost agent, what are the values of randomness or partial randomness as a search strategy? Which is to say, suppose you do decide to walk one direction, and that ends up becoming a partially random choice, or you decide at some point that there are switches in strategy along the way that can be thought of as partially random, which may break those who are searching out of kind of local suboptima of a kind of a search. That's all.
Well, certainly one of the limitations of doing a retrospective study is I only have the data I have. So the vast majority of the time, I have really no idea what the subject was doing. And keep in mind that becoming lost is only one of many scenarios of why we may be conducting a search for an individual. Among lost hikers, lost is the most common. It accounts for 68% of the motivations. They may simply be overdue. They may have had a medical problem. They may have had trauma. We also have investigative outcomes where you find them in a bar. So we actually have to keep all of those things in mind. Some of my data contributors do say what the motivation or what strategy that the subject was actually trying to do. But for the most part, I don't have access to that data.
Would you expect if there were, I'm interested in disorientation as kind of something that might be observable in these kinds of data. If you had suppose you could get some sort of data on the state of dehydration of the individual upon the time of having been rescued, and or looking at the variability of the walk as a function of time lost, right? Which might also track such a measure, might track other things as well. Are those plausible?
It's plausible. I think it's largely reflected in the distance from the IPP model, that if you have a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of random walks, what you find is almost just a circular normal distribution, where over time most people will actually be found relatively close to the IPP, and there's not going to be that many people who get far away. So the distance from the IPP model is actually the most robust and most predictive of all of those models I showed, even though it's the simplest.
So the vessel process is right. So, okay.
Thanks.
Sorry, that's it.
Great. And we have one more question, please. Thanks.
Hi, great talk. I'm Matt Wood. I'm from the Army Engineer Research and Development Center. I'm trained as a cognitive psychologist by training, and so this piece about decision points is really prescient to me. And I know in the cognition literature, when you have full information on some environment and you know where you're starting and where you want to end up, there might be certain strategies that you induce to minimize the time or effort required to end up at that location. In a lot of your work, you identify these decision points where individuals go wayward, maybe based on their knowledge about where they feel like they should be going, or what they think their location might be. Can you speak a little bit to maybe basic research, sort of laboratory work on these strategies given full information, and how they might relate to the more operational community where individuals are becoming lost because they don't have as full knowledge of the total environment as they thought they might have? Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, my laboratory is the wilderness. So I'm certainly not the person to be asking, a review of the literature on decision points, because really nobody has done kind of the field work that I have done. What we can do as a search and rescue manager, however, is look at the maps. We have the advantage of knowing, there's almost 100% chance the person made a mistake somewhere. So given that we know they probably made a mistake somewhere, where are the more likely places they made a mistake? And that really starts to guide us as to where to look. About 80% of our tasks that we send out make the finds based upon, here's a couple of likely places they made a mistake. If they made a mistake, they would have gone this way. This is where we need to send a team. What I'm not doing is controlling it in any sense of the imagination.
Well, how about this? Let's thank Bob for a great talk and also for finding us if we're lost. Thanks.